Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host, Adam Jasser. President Donald Trump vented his frustration that the promised peace deal for Ukraine remained elusive due to Vladimir Putin's obstinacy. The Europeans may have had their "we told you so" moment, but even if peace remains distant, they need to decide soon if they have the stomach to send troops to secure it.
It was an inauguration like no other. Washington gathered former US presidents and some of the world's wealthiest, but the focus remained on one man.
The Honorable Donald John Trump.
After 4 years out of office, he returned with a promise to restore America's greatness.
From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world.
His vision could be distilled into two familiar words:
America first.
In his speech, Trump pledged a bold national revival, including missions to Mars, tighter immigration controls, defeating inflation, and restoring America's manufacturing strength. On his first day, he signed over 25 executive orders and welcomed the ceasefire in Gaza, taking credit for it. Yet, he made no mention of the other major conflict he once vowed to end in a single day: Ukraine.
I want everybody to stop dying. They're dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying. And I'll have that done in 24 hours. I'll have it done.
And it is already evident that this promise will go unfulfilled. Russian President Vladimir Putin has shown no intention of compromising on his goal of subjugating Ukraine to his imperial ambitions. Trump's pick for Foreign Secretary, who sailed through the Senate confirmation this week, made clear, however, that Putin would have to move sooner or later.
These are complicated things. I don't want to and can't put a time frame on it, except that anytime you try to end a conflict between two sides, neither of which can achieve their maximum goals, each side is going to have to give something up.
Trump's campaign ambivalence towards Ukraine on Wednesday gave way to impatience to get a deal done, which would allow him to focus on his domestic agenda and fulfill his inaugural day promise to be a peacemaker.
I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with.
If Trump follows through on this threat of new sanctions, it will be welcome news for Europe. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen reaffirmed Europe's steadfast commitment to Ukraine's right to choose its destiny.
We will continue to support Ukraine without any question. Whatever happens next, for us it's important that Ukraine stays an independent country and that it is Ukraine that decides on its own territory. The sentence is still valid. We stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes.
To discuss the future of peace in Ukraine, I'm joined today by Ian Brzezinski, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO Policy in President George W. Bush's administration. Good evening and welcome.
Good evening, Adam. Thank you for having me on.
We're always delighted to have you on. Garry Kasparov wrote of Mr. Trump's post threatening Russia with sanctions, quote, "Putin stopped reading after the first sentence. Russia won't stop its unprovoked war on Ukraine without the pain of much higher military, economic, and political costs." So my question to you is, has Mr. Trump underestimated Mr. Putin's obstinacy?
Possibly. He probably thought during the campaign this would be easier, attaining a just peace would be easier to achieve than what he's now realizing. Now, I agree with Kasparov. I'm uncomfortable with President Trump, calling for a deal. I mean, when you plead for a deal, when you call for negotiations, in the eyes of Putin, that's akin to pleading. It's akin to waving a white flag. Trump and our NATO allies need to kind of get into Putin's mindset. That's the mindset of a former Soviet KGB officer who thinks in Soviet terms, who thinks in terms of the correlation of forces. Trump's strategy should be maximum pressure, changing the correlation of forces so that Russia comes to the table begging for a deal. Kasparov is absolutely right. Now is the time to ramp up pressure on Russia, force him to the table, not plead to him to come to the table.
So would you argue that President Trump, in a sense, by his earlier statements, became hostage to his own promises and now is trying to make up lost ground, if you will, in this negotiation?
No, I think he's facing the reality of responsibility in this war, not for this war, but in this war when it comes down to protecting transatlantic security interests. During the campaign, he said this was a European issue. This was, this was caused by Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO. He pledged to end U.S. assistance to Ukraine. He expressed fear of nuclear war. Well, now he's in office, and you're all of a sudden seeing kind of a change in tone. He described Russia as an adversary. He said he's not going to abandon Ukraine. He's gone from solving this conflict in 1 day to 100 days. So this is a recognition of kind of the reality of the difficulty of the situation and possibly also what is at stake for him, because he's bringing to the table a so-called national security policy of peace through strength. And he has to be careful about how he manages this Ukraine conflict, this Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it will be the defining issue of his foreign policy, of his national security policy. How he handles it will determine the credibility of his peace through strength national security posture.
And also in terms of his domestic audience, he promised to be a peacemaker, right? So, he needs to deliver now. So in your assessment, what happens next? What are we going to see in the next few weeks or months, based on your experience?
Well, let me put it this way. The next step probably is going to be his special representative to Ukraine, General Kellogg, visiting Ukraine and doing an assessment of the situation there, returning to the White House with his recommendations. When people talk about months, or they lock on to the statement that they're going to resolve this in the first 100 days, they do so at risk of forgetting that Trump makes decisions quickly. This is not the Biden administration. This is not the Obama administration, where there was process, deliberation, consideration, maybe incremental steps. There's one thing that Trump is, he's pretty decisive, either when he makes a right decision or the wrong decision. He's going to move fast, and he's going to determine whether or not there's prospects for a peace, and he's got three options. I think based on his past statements, it could be imposing on Ukraine an unjust peace, unstable peace. It could be walking away from this, saying, Europe, this is your problem, you're on your own, which would be the same outcome, an unjust peace, unstable peace, a recipe for further conflict. Or possibly, if the Europeans play their cards correctly, they could actually encourage him, cajole him, convince him to do the right thing, which is to really start thinking hard about and acting to change that correlation of forces that forces Russia to the negotiating table.
Right. So let me ask you this. How central is the question of NATO membership for Ukraine in all of this? Because we see Europeans now talking about possibly putting troops once there is ceasefire, not necessarily under NATO umbrella. So how central the question of NATO still is?
I think it's absolutely central. In my point of view, bringing Ukraine into NATO should be part of the win strategy. And there we can talk about how to do that.
But pardon me for saying this, but Mr. Trump doesn't seem to be quite favorable towards such a
No, he's
solution.
not. He's not. He's absolutely not. But you asked me what needs to be done and where does NATO fit into this calculus. Okay. And what I'm telling you as an analyst, that if you want to end this war quickly, decisively on Ukrainian terms, NATO membership has got to be part of the win strategy as much as it has to be part of the strategy to secure whatever peace you attain. Now, the question is would President Trump be willing to consider that? I think he'd be willing to consider that if the Europeans were ready to put on the table an offer of a deterrent force that's predominantly European to secure Ukraine, or at least to secure the territory Ukraine now controls. And I
So in
believe
other words, you're saying
Europeans
it's
need to move fast on that.
right. So in other words, you're saying it's a package deal. America remains engaged and can contemplate NATO membership for Ukraine, provided the Europeans put the boots on the ground to secure ceasefire.
If you think about Ukrainian membership in NATO in traditional terms, it basically infers the United States will provide 90% of the deterrent capacity to protect the sovereignty of that new member state. That was the case during the Cold War. That was the case in the post-Cold War era of the newest members. I mean, look how many U.S. troops are in Poland compared to West European troops. That is not the approach that's going to convince President Trump. But if you come in with a package, if the Europeans come with a package and saying, hey, we're willing to put in 2, maybe 3 divisions into Ukraine, that's, a force that will be European in character, European in personnel, European in equipment, but with a small U.S. element, that could be appealing to Trump because it would demonstrate to him that the Europeans are carrying their share of the burden.
And they're
It would
not
be
just
a win for him.
And they're not just talking, but they're actually delivering. President Zelensky yesterday in Davos mentioned that such a European force, and of course we're speaking hypothetically still at this point, but he said such a force would have to be about 200,000 troops. Well, people were polite, but I could see fear creeping into their eyes. Is Europe capable of delivering 200,000 troops?
I think that would be a stretch, and I'm not sure that's actually necessary. What's necessary is to have a sufficient enough force in Ukraine that would convince Putin that if he hit that force, he would be hit hard very fast and, very decisively and very destructively. And, my estimate would be a force of about 2 to 3 divisions. That's somewhere between 40 and 60,000 forces with air cover, with air and missile defense capabilities, and also long-range strike, enough to really hurt the Russians. And right now, Russia may be winning this war slowly and steadily, but it is in no position to take on both Ukraine and NATO. So this is the moment to act decisively.
Right. So we've had the French proposal, right, already a year ago, sort of softly. The Poles are ambivalent, it seems to me at least. The Germans are now talking more openly about the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine, which was unthinkable a few years back for historical reasons mostly, and for domestic reasons. So who else do you see contributing to that force of 40, 50,000?
I could see the Italians, I could see the UK, I could see Scandinavians, and then you throw in other elements from other allies. You could come up with that capability. I mean, let's put it this way. If the Europeans can't come up with that force, we have real problems in NATO. And I have more confidence in NATO than that.
Right. So should Poland be part of this force?
Absolutely. I mean, Poland's got a lot at stake here. Poland's got a very good force. Poland likes to see itself as a leader of NATO. If it's going to live up to that moniker, then it needs to contribute.
Right. So Polish Prime Minister Tusk spoke this week in European Parliament to deliver the message that Europe needs to get serious about defense. Let's listen for a moment to what he had to say.
If today the President of the US says that Europe needs to take on greater responsibility for its own defence, let's treat it as a challenge that can spur us into action. Do not ask America what it can do for our security anymore. Ask yourselves what we can do for our security.
I mean, this is just one of many announcements of this sort coming from European leaders. Do you think they are serious this time around, or is it still just talking?
Right now, I think it's primarily talking, but they're getting more and more serious. I fundamentally agree with what Prime Minister Tusk was saying. Europe needs to do more. But I get worried that Europeans kind of look at basically 2 scenarios. One scenario is America does everything for Europe. America provides all the security for Europe, and they just coast along. And then the other scenario is America abandons Europe and the Europeans do it all alone on their own. And, you know, that's sovereignty, Europe standing on its own and such. There's a balance in the middle where the Europeans carry the bulk of their forces. And as to use Secretary Rubio's analogy, the United States serves as a backstop. So in the case of a deterrent force for Ukraine, you know, it's 80 to 90% European, but maybe a U.S. command element, a U.S. intelligence, some U.S. air cover, some U.S. missile defense, some U.S. long-range strike, backing up what is predominantly a European force. It's not just the United States securing Europe or only Europe supporting its own defense without the United States. It's got to be an appropriate balance. And this is increasingly urgent when the transatlantic community is facing challenges not just in Europe, but in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere around the world.
Would you say that, I have two questions. Let me start with the first one now in response. First of all, if you look at the European countries, who do you think at the moment takes it seriously? We know the Nordics do. We know Poland does. We know the Baltics. But are French serious when they say these things about, you know, strengthening the European component, becoming a little bit more self-reliant? Will they, at the end of the day, be prepared to follow that through with moving, for example, a division there?
They have the capacity collectively to do this. They clearly don't have sufficient capacities to even fulfill NATO's current defense plans. I mean, one of the key the good news is we now have reasonable defense plans that are serious about defending NATO forward. The challenge is ensuring that the Europeans have the forces and the industrial firepower to really implement those plans. I see Europe moving in the right direction, but I get haunted by this sense that Europe says it's either the United States handling its security for it, or it does it on its own because the United States has abandoned Europe. The United States is not going to abandon Europe unless the Europeans decide they're going to go with that first option.
Unless
what
Europeans,
I'm positive about is they're taking defense more seriously.
Unless Europeans abandon themselves. So here comes my second question related to what you just said, which is, how does China and U.S. priority with China come into the picture here? We have discussed at length that Mr. Trump is transactional, and we know that his priority is China. So is he going to expect the Europeans to contribute in some way to how he handles China? Or is it going to be enough for him that they handle Ukraine and European affairs in a more decisive way, as we just discussed?
Look, when the president is sitting behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, and I think he's probably recognizing that his number one challenge right now is to prevent three increasingly volatile regions of the world from metastasizing into a global conflagration. He's got high-intensity warfare in Europe over Ukraine. He's got expanding violence across the Middle East. And he's dealing with a China that's increasingly provocative, aggressive, and militarily capable. And these three conflicts these crises are now linked. They are driven by a coalition of adversaries: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And if he's not careful, these crises could metastasize into something truly catastrophic. So that's his number one priority. But when it comes down to preventing that from happening, there is a prioritization. And the first priority is to end the conflict on Ukraine on just and stable terms. Because if you do that, you're basically neutralizing Russia, and you're establishing a precedent that makes the other adversaries, China, Iran, all of a sudden start rethinking their calculus that they have a moment to move forward on their revanchist ambitions.
But
that's the recognition I'm hoping is coming to the White House.
Well, yes, hope I think is the correct word, because we heard that before. We heard that, you know, from the Obama administration as well, that they were treating Ukraine as a lesson also to China and other potential powers, like sort of aggressive powers. But then we heard from Trump and his people saying, no, this is pushing us towards the Third World War. So was that just rhetoric and now he's becoming, as you said at the beginning, more rational? Or is it just events, dear boy, events?
You know, I think in some ways, and something that concerns me, is that there's an impression in the world that the United States has lost its will to fight, its will to defend its values and its interests. And that's a perception that extends to the transatlantic community too. I mean, there's no question we have overwhelming capability militarily, economically, and ideologically, but we're no longer exercising it as decisively. That was a real and legitimate criticism that Trump was making of President Biden and to a certain degree of President Obama. Well, now he's in office. He's talked about a peace through strength national security strategy. And what he doesn't want to do is undermine the credibility of that strategy by starting off with a kind of capitulation to Russia, a Chamberlain-like concession to Russia. That will probably just invite wider war in Europe, but also, energize our adversaries, including China, against us. So I think they're beginning to recognize that in the White House. Whether or not they'll fully recognize it and whether or not Europe will do what's necessary to push him in that direction is still open to question.
So what would you, if you were, let's say you're an advisor to Prime Minister Tusk, Ursula von der Leyen, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, what would be your 3 points that they should really deliver on?
First, Mr. President, if you want to avoid a wider war, a global conflagration, which you have stated you don't want any more enduring wars to drag in the United States, you've got to solve the situation in Ukraine. That's your top priority. So if your top national security interest of avoiding a wider war, Ukraine is your first priority. Second, if you want your peace through strength strategy to have real credibility, that's going to be determined on the battlefields of Ukraine. So exercise your power to change the correlation of forces and force Ukraine to come to the negotiating table and accept our terms. And third, I'd recommend that the Europeans, Prime Minister Tusk, President Duda, and others step forward and say, Mr. Trump, we're willing to put a deterrent force in place. It's going to be 80 to 90% European in composition, but we need that American dimension to give it true credibility, make a true deterrent in the eyes of the Russians. That's what we're offering you. And if you stand up with us in this, you'll bring peace to Ukraine, you'll establish military stability in Europe, and you will ensure that your national security policy starts off with a victory rather than a defeat.
Well, I think they'd better start listening to you. I think one worry a lot of Europeans are expressing at the moment is that President Trump doesn't really care about Ukraine that much, and that he's preoccupied with the domestic situation. And he opened so many fronts domestically that he's going to be so preoccupied with that even China is not going to become an adequate priority for him. Would you say that these are legitimate concerns, or is it just overblown?
Of course, every president, when they come into office, and particularly when Trump comes back into office, they're always they want to be primarily focused on their domestic agenda. But the problem is that national security always creeps in. And we're in a world today he is inheriting a more volatile, more dangerous geopolitical landscape globally. And he's not going to be able to avoid that. And if he wants to really focus on his domestic priorities, he has to ensure that these 3 major conflicts don't escalate into something even more dangerous. That's why I think there's a reasonable chance to get his attention on Ukraine. And by the way, my understanding is that in every conversation he's had with European leaders, Ukraine has been the first and most important and most dominant issue. He's been asking really hard questions. How determined is Putin? How long can the Ukrainians last? And we've already seen a slight change in his language. As I said, he describes Russia as an adversary. He's berating Putin on Twitter. He's talking about 100-day versus 1 day. He said he's not going to abandon Ukraine. That's not a decisive indication he's going to do the right thing, but it gives more room for hope.
Right. Well, you told us a few months back, and you mentioned Mr. Chamberlain just a moment ago, but you said then Mr. Trump was risking becoming the Chamberlain of our times if he allows Russia to swallow Ukraine. So how do you assess this risk after his initial statements, after what we have seen in the last few weeks?
It's still there, because these small statements that I mentioned, they're slivers against a big backdrop. Again, I'll emphasize, he said Ukraine's NATO aspirations caused this war. He criticized and promised to end assistance to Ukraine. He said Putin was a genius, indicating this is water over the dam. He has said he wants to avoid nuclear war. His advisors have come up with a proposal which is really troubling, which is basically to force Ukraine to submit to a ceasefire, accept Russian sovereignty over the territory.
So in other words,
it's occupying.
So in other words, he still has a lot of backtracking to do.
He does, because while they've talked about a deal, while he's called for an end of the war, he is yet to articulate what that end would look like, and that's really important.
Thank you so much for your time and your comments. This was very insightful. It was a pleasure having you on our show.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me on.
This was On the Record. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next week.